The first of these techniques, and the first thing that I always do to every shot ever, is white balance correction. Your camera's white balance is set based on the type of light that you're shooting in. Having the wrong white balance can result in a colored cast on your image. For example, if you have your white balance set to daylight, such as sunlight, then indoor incandescent lights will appear orange. The other way around, if you have your white balance set to those indoor incandescent lights, then daylight will appear more blue. Now, even if you have your white balance set correctly, you will almost always have a very minor cast on your image, usually orange or blue. However, this is really easy to fix as long as you have something in your shot that's gray. To correct white balance, drag the white balance effect from the effects panel onto your clip. Then, using the eyedropper, pick a color that is a neutral gray in your image. Not a pixel that is a neutral gray, an object in the frame that is a neutral gray in real life. The white balance effect will shift all of the colors in your image until that particular shade has turned to a neutral gray. Now that you've removed that cast from your image, let's move on to color correction. If you shoot with a neutral picture setting, you probably have lower contrast and saturation. We'll get to the contrast later, but for now I'll just add in a little bit of extra saturation to compensate for the picture profile. You can also tweak the saturation values of individual colors based on the type of project. For example, if you're making a nice green nature video, you can add some saturation to the blues and the greens to bring out leaves and trees and the sky and all that. Yeah. And the next thing that I'll do is wash out the shadows. Using curves, I'll create a point in the middle of the line and a point halfway between the middle and the bottom of the line. That point in the middle will separate the shadows from the highlights so that we are only affecting the shadows. I'll then use the bottom point and the point in between the very bottom and the middle to brighten the completely black areas of the image and to darken the not quite black shadows. This way you're adding contrast to the image without crushing any of the shadows. It's very common for people to say that the crushed blacks and whites effect will make a more cinematic look. The more sort of modern cinematic look that I've noticed is having a lot of detail in the shadows, very little clipping, and overall a very washed out appearance. One of my favorite things about this technique is that you can actually sort of cover up grain with it. However, you will pretty much always lose detail to some extent. Now let's move on to the edge blur. There are a couple of ways to do this, the first of which is by using a zoom blur and a radial blur together. I'll make the center of both the zoom blur and the radial blur the focal point of the image, and I'll set the strength of the effects to be very, very low. You want this to subtly draw the eye to the focal point of the image, not force your viewer to look at it. If you don't like the look of having zoom blur and radial blur together, you can do this with a normal blur or a lens blur. Start by making your footage into a new composite shot and creating a new grade or adjustment layer. We'll then add a blur or lens blur to this layer. Then I'll create an elliptical mask in the center of the grade layer and invert and feather it. Finally, lower the opacity of the grade layer as needed. Something that goes well with an edge blur is a vignette. A vignette is a darkening around the edges of a frame. You can either create your own or use the ones that are pre-built into your editing software. To create your own, use a similar process to that of making the edge blur, but instead of a grade layer, use a black plane. There's also a vignette effect in the effects panel, which is just as customizable as creating your own. Finally, I'll sharpen the image. Sharpening can't save a blurry shot or increase the resolution in your image, but it can enhance the detail in certain parts. Just make sure you don't go overboard with it. I like to turn the strength all the way up, but keep the feature size low. Keep in mind when you're doing this though, that sharpening can make the image appear grainy. Anyway, that is all for today. Make sure to like and share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe because I make new videos like this every week. Anyway, see you in the next one.